Alhamdulillah, wa ala Rasulillah. So, in the previous session, we were talking about Christianity. We began talking about it. Talked about the origins of Christianity and its main sources. Today, we're going to go over the history of Christianity to see how it actually developed. And the history we're going to talk about is after Isa alayhi salam was lifted to the heavens. Right? So this is not the history of Christianity in its initial stages. It's when the corruption actually began coming into the religion. So after Isa alayhi salam, between the first and the third century of Common Era, which is known as the era of trials and tribulations or the trial of message. And so what happened is it's a very famous personality in the Christian religion, Saint Paul, right? Anybody who studied Christianity heard about it knows Saint Paul. And so this person was originally a Jew, and in the time of Isa alayhi salam, he was actually an opponent, and he opposed this new message with all his might. It's only after Isa alayhi salam passed away, so he never actually got the chance to accept Christianity or Islam in the time of Isa alayhi salam. He only accepted it after he passed away, and then he became a supporter of this new religion, right? But what happened is during this time, because he wanted to render Christianity as a null religion, as a void religion, what he did was he rendered all the laws of Torah as now inadmissible. So anything, any hukum that you had in Torah, which would have applied to the Christian population, was now rendered null. None of the ahkam, none of the laws of Torah were now applicable on the general population. And second, what he did was try to give Christianity a new meaning and show it in a new light. So basically, what was supposed to be an extension of the original Jewish message was now being altered to a degree that it was now represented as something entirely new, right? So this new version of Christianity is now being presented to the people. But on the same time, this person, Paul, and those who associate themselves with him actually also made a lot of sacrifices in propagating this new religion of theirs. And because at that time the Roman Empire was pagan in nature, so these new people who were supporting this belief in one God, however twisted version of the truth it may have been, they were persecuted at the hands of the Romans because the Romans were pagans and they could not accept this concept of one single God. So in these first 3 centuries, the early supporters of Christianity had to face a lot of persecution, but they kept treading on and they kept delivering the message of their Lord to the people. And the second era is known as the Age of Councils. This is when it was actually the scholars and the ulama of that ummah who had the reins of the empire, right? And so, because of the previous 3 centuries of da'wah work going on, the influence of Christianity was penetrating through the Roman society until the Roman Emperor Constantine actually accepted Christianity. And when he did that, usually when the leaders or the king accepts a religion or an idea, its acceptance spreads throughout the society, and that's how the Roman Empire transformed and shifted from its pagan worldview to a Christian worldview, right? And so those ulama who now had the say in what would go on, they sat down and they started developing the principles of the Christian religion and the particulars. So for 3 centuries, there was no literature, nothing was actually being documented about the Christian religion. It was only after these 3 centuries and when Christianity gained acceptance in the Roman Empire that the scholars sat down, and that's why it's known as the Age of Councils, because there were different councils in different cities being formed where they would debate and discuss what would be part of the Christian religion. what would take the primary role, what would be the principles, and what would be the particulars. Especially in 325, in a place called Nicaea, one of these councils sat down, and that is when the idea of Trinity actually entered into the folds of Christianity. So before that, it was a belief in just one God, right? But after this event and after this shura and this council, the idea of Trinity entered the mainstream Christian thought. The third period is known as the period of anarchy, between the 5th and 6th century. And this is when the Byzantine Roman Empire, this now Christian empire, actually divided into two halves. So it divided into a European empire and an Asian empire, right? So the capital of the European empire used to be Rome in Italy, while the capital of the Asian Byzantine Empire would become Constantinople, which is nowadays known as Istanbul. And not only was there a divide in the kingdom, there was also a divide in the church. So now the Asian Empire, they were now referred to as the Orthodox, and the Roman Empire, or the European Byzantine Empire, was now known as uh, the Catholics. So this was the first divide, large divide within the Christian religion. The leader of the Asian or the Orthodox was known as the Patriarch, while the leader of the Catholics was known as the Pope. The next period in the Christian religion or history is known as the Dark Ages, and you can broadly divide the Dark Ages into two eras. So the first lasted between 590 to 800, Common Era, and this is the same time when Islam came into this world. Actually, it was always there. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came into the world with the proper explanation of the original Islam that has been in this world since Adam alayhi salam. So he came with that message, and it actually spread through Arabia, and then after him, in times of, especially in times of Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhuma, it spread throughout Europe and Asia and Africa, right? And so this was a dark period for the Christians, because Christianity actually retreated from most of Asia and Africa and was now confined to only Europe. Even parts of Europe would now come under Muslim rules. Spain is a very famous example of that. So that widespread Byzantine Empire, which reigned from Asia all the way to Africa, now retreated just into a small part of Europe. The second part of this Dark Ages, it's from 800 to 1521 Common Era. And what happens is initially when the Roman Empire accepted Christianity, it was the religious figures, the popes, that had all the authority, right? But their authority was dwindling day by day, and the kings, they also started amassing the authority till it came a point when the two were clashing against each other. And this is also the era, if you might remember, where the Crusade Wars were actually waged. And those who sparked the wars were these popes, these religious leaders. And because they were so badly defeated, right, all the blame was put on them, was placed on them, and this gave the kings another reason to strip them of their power. And so a 200-year struggle between the church and the state now began. And as you know, the result of which was that secularism came into being, where church life, where religious life was sanctioned from the public sphere altogether. But this is known as the second stage of the Dark Ages, where it was state versus church to see who controls the political affairs of the empire of the society. Now, within the Dark Ages, there are a few people who actually tried to reform Christianity. They weren't very successful. They wanted to actually change the principles of Christianity at that time, right? So there were actually two Johns and a Jerome. John Wycliffe, John Huss, and Jerome. These three people, first of all, they translated the Bible from Latin to English. That was one of the big things they did. Second is they rejected some of the Catholic principles and started to introduce new principles, right? So this was the effort that was being done in order to reform Christianity, although it didn't bear fruition in their own lives. And that only happened in 1570 and 1529, between this period where Martin Luther, a German, was actually able to bring out that reform that his predecessors were aiming for. Now, this Martin Luther is not the same one uh, who actually led the Black movement in America. That's another character, and some people might get confused. So, this was a German, and he was actually a pope. Like, he was one of the reverends in the Catholic tradition, but he realized that there was a lot of problems with that, right? And so he began initially critiquing uh, the Catholic tradition, right? And started a movement of reformation, which literally means to change, right? For example, some of the things that he criticized was that the popes had the right to issue forgiveness certificates for people. So people would come, tell them of their sins, pay a certain amount, and get a certificate of being forgiven by God. And he rejected this idea, saying that it was only God who had the permission to forgive someone. No one can do that on his behalf. That was the first thing. And number second thing, he introduced Bible studies to the people. Instead of relying just on the popes to actually tell them what the Bible says, he motivated the masses to actually start reading the Bible. And this has always been something which is a double-edged sword, right? First of all, having a group of people literally having a hold over a religious text, that creates its own set of problems. But when you unconditionally bring about these texts to everybody, whether or not they have the prerequisites needed, it also creates another set of fitan in which that religion or that text loses all meaning because every single person is going to have an interpretation of their own, no matter what they're bringing to the table, right? And so this is something that actually happened because of it. But anyhow, he was able to bring about this reform, this change in the Catholic principles, and hence the Protestant section of Christianity was born. And he got such a mass following that in 1529, the Pope actually conceded, and every ruler, every king of every kingdom or country was able to decide for themselves whether their country would be following the Catholic religion or the Protestant religion of Christianity. And that is exactly that led to this rationalization of things, right? So Martin Luther was the first one who actually dared to speak against what he thought was wrong. He was able to first one to critique the different explanations of Injil that have been going on, of the Bible that had been going on, right? But again, this also gave way to let anybody use their logic and their understanding to interpret the Bible. And hence, this rationalist approach also gave way to atheism, because when you don't know the full context of a text, And when you don't have the required knowledge of a text, you can't understand it, you can't make heads and toes of it. The logical conclusion to that is that you end up rejecting it, or you end up actually throwing it aside, thinking that it is unsolvable. And so that's what happened when everybody was doing it, and the only thing that they had in common was using their own rationale, which we also talked about previously, that most people don't think, and those who do think don't think properly enough, right? And so this rationalism led way to atheism as well. And this actually led to Christianity taking a backseat in society. Then came within the same era, the modernist movement, because this rationalism had very detrimental effects to society. The whole structure started crumbling. So what the more intelligent people of the society, what they did was to modernize Christianity. That is to study the text in light of scientific evidence or in light of whatever knowledge they had acquired in that era. So they didn't just take Christianity and threw it against the wall. They accepted it, but only as at face value. Behind it, works were going on in order to change it, in order to reinterpret it, in order to fulfill scientific needs and knowledge that they had acquired at that time. Now, this whole thing has its own set of problems. We're not going to go into detail about that, but that is what they did: accept Christianity at face value and behind the scene change everything that you know about it. And this led to the Counter Reformation. And so the Catholic Church, after losing all of its influence and everything that it stood for, uh, Pope Paul IV, what he did was to start a counter Reformation technique in which he basically reorganized the Catholic Church, and all the damage that was done against it, he was trying to fix that and bring people back to what the old Christianity that had been formed in the Age of Councils was, right? And so basically, this is the Catholic Church raising its head against Martin Luther and all of his efforts. And now today we have the 21st century, in which the church is literally a figurehead of Christianity, right? And Christianity itself has now transformed into a rationalist, modernist, and orthodox tradition all at once. So you have all these three factions working together in this world today, right? So you have a Catholic Church, you have an Orthodox Church, you have a Protestant Church. Then each church within these is on a spectrum of accepting certain things and not accepting others, and such and so on, that it's really hard to discern what the truth might be in any of these, right? Even their fundamentals, just like Hinduism, is something that is hard to agree upon. And that was a small and brief timeline of Christian history. Now let's talk about Western philosophy, or materialistic philosophy, which basically merged into Christianity first and then spread out, creating most of the world's problems that we know today. Now let's look at the timeline of Western philosophy, right? So Western philosophy, or philosophy, basically, we can divide into 8 periods. with the eighth period still going on right now. So the first period was the era of Greek philosophy, which is very well known because whenever you talk about philosophy, people tend to push it back straight to the ancient Greeks, not realizing that philosophy is inherent to every society. And the earliest society were not the Greeks. It was the probably it was either the Indus civilization or the Babylonian civilization in Iraq. So the concept of what philosophy is has existed since then, right? But anyhow, because when we talk about these something that has been written down in history, that we can say that it was actually Greek philosophy that took place, right? And so the first era is of the Greek philosophy, which is basically the cradle of it. So this actually happens 7 centuries before Christianity, right? And in Greece, ancient Greece, for the longest period of time, these people were pagans, right? And the concept of multiple gods had ownership over the minds of the people. It wasn't until 7 centuries before the rise of Christianity that philosophers started to appear in this region. For the people like, for example, Faisal, Horus, or Bukrat, these were quite famous, right? And 4 centuries before Christianity, uh, philosophy actually was now a dominant subject in ancient Greece, right? And this is the pinnacle of philosophy. And then you have people like Aristotle, Socrates, right? These were the people, these very famous philosophers that reigned the era. And they were known as Falasifa Mashayin. Actually, their way of teaching was not to sit in a classroom. They would keep on walking while discussing these topics. And Aristotelian dialect is actually very famous, in which the way of learning is that you're not administered information, is that you keep on talking, you keep asking questions and answering them, and then asking questions on those answers, right? Until you come up to a point where you think that there could be nothing that goes beyond this. There were two big uh, groups for these philosophers, and they usually had a lot of, uh, you could say, like in wars between them. Now, the problem is the whole subject of philosophy was built without divine revelation, which means those subjects which are impossible for the human mind to fully grasp and understand, it was also subjected to human logic. And as we know, each human's thinking pattern is completely different from the others. But these people, anyhow, without any divine help, try to understand all of these things, which led to their beliefs and aqaid being actually very distorted and very different, right? And the concept of Tawheed and Wahdaniyah, that there's one single God, was made totally unfamiliar to them. And along with that, when you don't have a concept of a God or a proper God, all of the attributes that God has are also made uh, unavailable to them, right? and they ended up creating this concept of عقول عشرة, i.e. 10 minds, in which there's this, instead of a god, there's a mind who created the first world and another mind. And after that, he went into a break, or that mind went into a break. And then the second mind created the second world or the second sky and the third mind. And this went on until it reached this 10th mind, which is now basically al-aql al-mudabbir, the one that controls everything right now, right? So this concept of that the mind had to go through 10 rebirths, or there had to be 10 different versions of it to actually reach at a level where it could control the entire world. This is the kind of philosophy that they came into when they could not comprehend the concept of a god. And whatever they did, because they didn't believe anything divine, they don't believe in the hereafter or anything, all of their efforts were focused on this material world. So you would find, and we have to give them credit, it's a tremendous work that they did, that those philosophers did, that without divine revelation, they only used their intellect to be able to talk about every different subject. Take Aristotle, for example. There might not be a single subject, material subject, that he has not talked about, be it history, psychology, sociology, be it physics, be it economics, be it politics. So every social sciences, he has talked about it. And you can find works of his still present there, right? So they used their brains and were able to come up with a lot of these things, right? But till that, it was okay. But when you start talking about things that you cannot experience or that are immaterial in nature, that is the biggest problem that these philosophers had. The second period is the Roman period, which lasted between first and fifth century of Christianity. And because at this time, the biggest and largest power was actually the Roman Empire or the Roman Europe, right? So it actually started before Isa alayhi salam, before Christianity, 64 years before that. And 3 centuries of Christianity were included in all of this. Now, the Romans initially, as you know, they were pagans, weren't Christians, right? So they only knew the language of war, right? So unlike the Greeks, who weren't fighting that much, but were more obsessed with these philosophical debates and acquiring knowledge and stuff. So things that attracted them were talking about the beauty of uh, people and the beauty of things, right? And so they were basically worshippers of beauty in all its forms. The Romans, on the other hand, because philosophy and knowledge was not such a thing over there yet, they were people of action. They were people who knew the language of war, right? And so the only thing that they understood is that strength is everything, right? And this intoxication of the strength that they had, of the power that they have, uh, it made connection with God completely useless. Because one of the reasons why a person connects with a deity is because they feel the power, the awe of the power of that deity that they have above them. But because these people in their time were so powerful, they were conquerors of the earth or whatever area that they had, and this made them disconnect with the idea and the concept of worshiping any creator whatsoever, right? And so the only thing that they could do, or that what logic would have dictated, was that we have power. In order to sustain power, obviously we need support. Support, especially from our own populations, because if they were to go against us, we might lose that power, right? And so the concept of nationalism, first time, actually started appearing in this period. Now, the concept of tribal loyalty has always existed, but that happened in specific tribes and families. But on a nation scale, where different people of different ethnics and different tribes all come together under one banner to form a state and a nation, this is the period when this uh, phenomena first started realizing. And then came the Middle Ages, right, from the 5 to 15th century. And this is where there was a religious birth of Christianity, right? So now religion was on the rise, and this whole philosophical concept of using your brain and everything that the Greeks brought in with them was pushed to the back seat. And everything that we talked about in the Christian religion just happened over here. All of the zulm and all of the transgressions that the church did against people who thought, people who did science, right? All those witch hunts and executions and everything that was happening. So these Middle Ages, or also known as the Dark Ages of Europe, this is the period when all of this was happening. But as you know, Martin Luther came in critiquing Christianity, Catholic Church, bringing in a new religion, bringing it with it rationalism, modernity, and everything else. And the Catholic Church loses all its power, it's been thrown to the side, secularism comes in, and this is the part of Renaissance, where now they're free of what they believe from religious constraints and can now put their efforts on focusing on developing the sciences, right? So religion has now failed them and logic has taken over. And there were a lot of things that were going on, right? So one of the reasons why it was needed, the Renaissance was needed, was the Crusade Wars, the defeat. Christianity was totally defeated. People realized that this religion cannot serve us. It does not have what it needs to run an actual society. So that's number one. Number two is that number two, what happens is that the all the development at the same time that was happening in the Islamic world, all of in all fields, that was now coming into Europe, and so people were now learning all of these sciences, all of these new ulum and knowledge, and like the University of Cambridge and Oxford, for example, were also established in this period. And the biggest thing that happened is in 1453, the Turks they actually conquered Istanbul. And what happened after they conquered Istanbul, the scholars and philosophers migrated to Europe, right? And when they migrated to Europe, they brought with them obviously all of that falsafa, all of that philosophy and the knowledge, and the theories and the philosophies of that nation were now spreading across Europe, right? And so again, the Greek philosophy, which had been lost for such a long time, was given a cradle, was given a place where it could now be reborn. And this was the period of the Renaissance, where religion had failed them and logic took over. The biggest problem with this period was that when they rejected religion and they realized that uh, everything which on which a society was built on was removed from them, they started introducing what we know today as the social sciences. They had now lost the foundation on which their society was built. They had to reconstruct it from scratch, and they brought in with it social sciences. Now, rather than importing a system that was already in place in the world and was functioning very well, what they did is to use their rationalism and to use their minds to reconstruct the entire thing. And they branded every religion across the globe to be the same as Christianity. Their reasoning is that Christianity is a religion and it failed to run a society, or it failed us. All other things, example Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever it is, all of these are religions, and hence they also will fail us, or hence all of these things are incapable of actually functioning a society. So they branded their own experience and labeled it across the board. What in logic we call this overgeneralization. And this is a fallacy. And based on this very fallacy, the entire field of social sciences has been built upon, right? Initially, obviously, there are a lot of things that have changed since then, but the entire field of social sciences was built on this very misconception, which is basically the highlight of the Renaissance period. Then came the period of rationalism, right? And this is the fifth era. We place this between the 15th and the 17th century. So sorry about that. The fifth period is the period of rationalism, and we'll place it at the end of the 17th, mid 17th to the 18th century, right? And this is the period when Greek philosophy was now free of philosophers themselves. Philosophy was no longer specific to the philosophers. It was no longer their trade anymore. So one of the main components of the rationalization period or rationalism is René Descartes, a French philosopher, right, who basically brought this notion that uh, God or fitra or nature is mechanical in nature, that it works just like a machine does. Or in other words, what he's basically saying is that this world is a machine and there is no divine force that is running it. And he said that doubt is the basis of all ilm, of all knowledge. What he meant was that other than your own self believing in that you exist, everything else in this world is doubtful. Or you could also state it that knowledge of whatever it is never 100% true. There's always room for doubt in it. Then this whole concept of having doubt in everything that you believe in went on a next step in which resulted in that there is no such thing as the truth. There is no such thing as the absolute truth. There's always subjective truth, which means you've probably heard these things. People say these things a lot too these days. My truth, or his truth, or her truth. What exactly is my truth or his truth? It is just the truth, right? There's something that is true, that is accordance to what is happening outside, and that's it. I might have a wrong perception of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean what I perceive is true, right? So the concept of subjective truth, that was the next step that came after Rene Descartes. And so a French philosopher, um, Michel de Montaigne, he brought in this fact, and he reasoned that he said that when I was a child, I really used to like cucumbers, but now I don't like them, right? And with that, he makes an analogy that this similarly, something that I think is the truth or is right today might not be in the future. It's all very relative, right? That truth itself changes with time and place. And now ilm, knowledge, which always had a fraction of doubt to it, now it was transformed into being something entirely subjective, which means, according to this philosophy, nothing in this world is right or wrong. What this means is that there is no concept of morality. If nothing is right or wrong, then there is no concept of there being something moral or immoral. So whatever you do from your perspective might be 100% true, right? And obviously you can think about what the damages such thinking could do to a society. And hence then there came a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, who also rejected every religious belief based on his notion that knowledge or true knowledge is anything that can be proven scientifically, right? Scientifically or through reason. So anything that does not meet the criteria of reason or science cannot be accepted as true knowledge. After that came the sixth uh, generation, that of the Industrial Revolution, and this ended up till World War One. And what this Industrial Revolution did was basically help support the period of rationalism because they had already rejected the unseen, the divine, the hereafter, and everything. The Industrial Revolution basically provided them heaven on earth. Now they could see their biggest dreams being realized. They could make things, they could provide for themselves and others means of comfort, transportation, machines, and whatnot. Life was becoming easier. And so they were experiencing a kind of heaven where all of those difficult times were behind them, right? And so as they grew materially, they started deteriorating morally and um, virtue and character. And you can understand the kinds of problems that rose with the rise of the machines, but the human self was not actually growing at the same time. Then came the era of false religions. And what we mean by false religions is basically false beliefs and philosophies, right? So a different kind, everybody using their brains would come up with new things. And so a lot of different ideas started spreading around in this era, which at the same time were actually conflicting with each other in such a manner that they could not be reconciled, but they existed everywhere. So Russia would have its own philosophy, Britain had its own philosophy, Asia would have its own, and so on. And all of these things would be conflicting together, right? So there are especially two philosophies that are worth mentioning over here. The first is pragmatism, which is basically practical philosophy. And according to them, no thought or no uh, reason, no opinion is right or wrong in itself. The only way to judge something, whether it's right or it's wrong, uh, is dependent on how practical is something. I have an idea, in itself it's not right or wrong, but whether or not it's practical and useful for the society. If it is, then it's okay. If not, then it's wrong. To give an example, let's take prostitution, for example. To say that prostitution is okay, it's something that should be normalized and legalized. In itself, it's not right or wrong. What benefits does it bring to society? Well, it generates a kind of an income for women. It also provides entertainment outlets for men, or maybe other women too, right? So seeing that it's boosting the economy and it's providing means of leisure entertainment for the people, according to pragmatism, prostitution should be a legal act. It should be something encouraged upon, right? So depending on what the conclusion and results of something is, of an idea is, that is the only basis on which you can judge whether something is good or bad. So that was pragmatism. The other thing was logical positivism. And to summarize this philosophy, it's basically to say that words don't define anything, or words don't mean anything in themselves. No word in itself means anything. In fact, every word and every sentence is specific to a context. So instead of looking at the words, we are supposed to look at the context. And depending on what the context is, any word could mean literally anything, right? So without context, nothing amounts to anything. What this basically saying is that if you have a holy book, you have the Torah, the Quran, the Bible, whatever you have, the sentences over there mean literally nothing. So when you say Allahu la ilaha illahu, that there is no God but Allah, that sentence in itself means nothing to a logical positivist. What they say is you go back and look at the context. What is the context that they would create? Is, for example, that this was said in pre Islamic Arabia where there was paganism and societies and tribes were divided according to the different deities that they have. For example, a tribe worships Lat, the other worships Uzza. So these tribes, because they worship different gods, would be at each other's throat, would be each other's enemy. And so, in their eyes, what Islam did was finish the concepts of multiple gods and brought in one god for the sake of unity of that geographical area, right? So, what they're saying is that it doesn't need to be necessarily true that there is only one God. That is what the context at that time decided. That is what this sentence would mean. So, in other words, we're not talking about the actual reality of what's happening because that's unknown to us. We can't really know. Anything anyone will say will be based totally on what the context is. Allahu A'lam bisawab. And so these were the two, not were the, are the two actually main philosophies that are functioning in society today as we speak as well. Anyhow, we come to the 21st century, which we will call the rebirth of Islam. What happened is in Islam has always existed through all these periods of rationalism, industrialization, era of false religions. but it was in the backseat because of the colonial project going on, imperialism, and so Muslims all over the world were in a very bad state. They were all, even though when they were released of their colonization, still people's belief and reading of Islam was not so much until what happened was in 1980 when the Jihad of Afghanistan took place, when Afghanistan was able to successfully defeat a power 10 to 50 times its size of the USSR, right? So it defeated the Soviet Union, and which was also at that time the center of communism, one of the biggest powers of that era, right? And so at that time when communism was totally defeated and the USSR broken down into different countries, and the New World Order was to take place, Islam posed a threat, right? And so you know about the 21 years that America and its allies waged war in Afghanistan trying to control it, but they were utterly defeated. That was one point where people started studying Islam, right? 9/11, post 9/11, everything that happened in Iraq. And now modern day Gaza is another example where a lot of people are rediscovering Islam. They're starting to read the Quran, they're starting to understand this new concept or this foreign concept, which makes its people so resilient, so grateful even in the face of all adversity, right? And so these things, this rebirth of Islam, this is what's happening. People are experiencing this. And at the same time, they're also experiencing the downfall of capitalism, which is going on as we speak today, right? Economically, every country is pretty much defeated. The social system, the family system, the society, especially in the Western world, has been damaged and failing for such a long time, and people are searching for alternatives. And so what they're seeing is this philosophy there, this religion that has always existed and is providing solutions. So this is a stage that we are in, and we're supposed to utilize this and we're supposed to capitalize on this actually very stage. People are now open, whether you go to South Korea, whether you go to Japan, right? These places where there was never, for the longest period of time, there's never been a God. All atheists, they're so willing to accept Islam right now because the thing that's missing is being provided. People in Europe, just last week, 60 sisters in Australia accepted Islam, right? And there are other people across the world. So there's this whole thing on TikTok in which non-Muslims, atheists, Christians, they're reading the Quran. So what's going on? What's going on is we're at a time where every other philosophy has literally failed, and people want an answer and want a solution. And we have the chance to provide it to them. We just have to be smart enough to realize that. And so this is the area in which we are standing in right now. But anyway, before we talk about that, there's something that we need to discuss too. Is that of all of those time phases that we've talked about, the philosophy has gone through, there have actually been three major movements that took place. So, whether it be pragmatism, logical positivism, rationalism, whatever it is, at the core of all of these things is desire and freedom, right? So, literally, at the core of all of those Western philosophies is desire, i.e., that people be given autonomy to fulfill their desires. And amongst the biggest desire a person has is that of freedom, i.e., that he or she not be controlled by anyone. And this core thinking and this core need of desire and freedom is what gave birth to three different movements: humanism, enlightenment, and romanticism. So I'll just briefly touch upon them. Humanism is basically the worship of humans, and this actually came into life with the Renaissance that took place after the Dark Ages, right? So before humanism, it was always believed that the children of Adam and Eve, they've always been human, and always been the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of a god, a deity. But this movement of humanism, what it did was it rejected the premise of ubudiyah. It rejected the premise that humans are enslaved to a deity, are enslaved to God, and that they are a free being. And so, what this movement is basically everything on earth. The human being is the most important, and everything else is subservient to the human, right? Uh, Khilafa or uh, Khalifatul Ars, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions humans, might seem similar to the concept of what humanism is, but it's actually very different because we act as a Khalifatullah, as Allah's representatives on earth. So that concept of ubudiyah, of our need of a deity, of a God, that still exists, even though we are, by Allah's words, the best of His creations and everything in this world is for our sake. Yet we are not the most important things on earth, or in the equation of creation, we are not the most important, and neither does the world revolve around us. But humanism says that we are free beings, free of God, free of any responsibility, and we basically can do what we want. Then you have the entitlement movement. This basically happened in the 17th and 18th century. It's a popular philosophical European movement. And what they do is they say that like the concepts of intellect, nature, human, God, they don't see it from a divine religious lens, they see it from a very worldly lens. And they present it in the form of art and of what they do is they present it in a form of art and form of philosophy and form of religion, right? Or a form of maybe a political system or something like that. And as you know from enlightenment, it's basically giving aql, giving the intellect the main seat, and whatever your mind says, your intellect says, that is something that should be acted upon. And the last of these movements was Romanticism, which happened in the 18th and 19th century, in which basically fine arts was given the control of society. And so music, architecture, arts, dance, history writing, and things like that had a very large impact on society. Basically, what I'm trying to say is in all three of these movements, what is established or what would be the summary of all of this is basically that the desires of humans, their happiness, their likes, are the only measure of what's right and what's wrong. If I don't desire something, then it's not right. If I don't like something, then it's not right. Right? And according to them, the ideal society would be that which fulfills the most human desires. And it is basically these three movements that led to the birth of secularism, liberalism, and communitarianism. So, secularism is basically in which you divide the human life into two parts: private life and social life, right? And your private life, you can act on any religion that you want, nobody's stopping you. But as far as the social life is concerned, the religion shall play no role, and only the brain or the intellect is something that you can use over there. Liberalism is established on three basic principles: that of freedom, equality, and justice. Freedom means that every person is free in their private life to do and believe whatever they want, right? And that freedom is limited to the fact that you can't interfere in an other person's life, right? So that's why liberalism also divides uh, what we do into two parts, into private life and into social life. And in social life, you are bound by the societal norms. You can't actually subject or interfere with that. While in your private life, you can do whatever you want. The difference between liberalism and secularism is secularism rejects religion to play any role in society, while liberalism allows for religion to play a role. If religious norms and values turn into societal norms and values, it's okay to adhere to a religion. But in your private life, you can do whatever you want, right? So that's a difference between being secular and being liberal. When you're secular, you reject religion to ever play a part in society at all. When you're liberal, you allow for it if it's accepted in the entire society. And then you have communitarianism, which basically says that public benefit or the benefit of the masses is the criteria of deciding how much freedom a person has. Or another way, you could say that the concept of public freedom is what communitarianism talks about. I Your private freedom is limited to or limited until it breaches public interests. And the main things that rose from this is socialism and communism, right? And liberalism is what gave birth to capitalism, in which anything, if it's a normal, accepted part of society, must also be acceptable to everyone, and you cannot interfere with it using religious means or norms.